I never thought that coming home early from the clinic that Tuesday would end up being the moment my entire life shattered. I stood frozen behind the kitchen door, one hand still gripping the shopping bag of oranges I'd bought on discount because my son liked them. I was hoping to surprise my son Daniel, maybe share a cup of tea and finally tell him I'd decided to stop working, that my heart wasn't what it used to be, and the doctor had begged me to slow down. But instead, I heard him. "Yeah, I'll finally sell the house now that she's useless. She can just rot somewhere else for all I care." He laughed into the phone, his tone casual, like he was discussing the weather. My heart thudded so violently, I thought it might leap right out of my chest. My knees wobbled, and I had to brace myself against the doorframe. I could feel the cold sweat gather at the back of my neck, my breath catching in my throat. All those years, 30 to be exact. 30 years of handing over every paycheck, quietly covering his failed businesses, his debts, his emergencies. I remembered the mornings I skipped my own medication just to make sure he had enough gas money. The nights I worked overtime cleaning offices so he wouldn't lose face among his friends. Every sacrifice felt like a twisted joke now, echoing in my ears. But standing there, hearing him say I was useless, something inside me snapped. A sudden, icy calm settled over me. It felt foreign, like slipping into someone else's skin, but comforting in its sharpness. My tears didn't fall. Instead, my mind sharpened, slicing through the fog of betrayal. For a moment, I wanted to walk into that kitchen and scream. Tell him what I had given up for him. Every single dollar I had funneled into his failing businesses, his debts, his whims. I had even sold my wedding ring quietly one year when he was about to lose his car. But I didn't move. A kind of cold, sharp clarity washed over me instead. A clarity I hadn't felt since my husband passed away decades ago. My mouth went dry as I listened to him brag about my sacrifices like they were nothing but stepping stones under his shoes. I took a slow breath and quietly stepped back from the doorway. I wiped my tears on my sleeve, straightened my back, and pressed my palm flat against the wall to steady myself. No more begging. No more waiting for scraps of affection. I would not let him sell the roof over my head and toss me aside like garbage. I turned and walked to my room, each step echoing with a new vow. I would reclaim every penny, every moment, every bit of my dignity he thought he had stripped away forever. After hearing Daniel's words, I escaped to the only place that still felt like mine, my little garden behind the house. I sat on the worn wooden bench under the rose arbor, the same spot I used to sit and watch him play with his toy trucks when he was 5. The roses were blooming wildly, crimson and pale pink, climbing and weaving into each other like they were trying to hold themselves up. I used to think they were a symbol of how love tangled and held families together. Now they just looked like a mess I had neglected while I was too busy keeping him afloat. I traced the ridges on my palms, my hands scarred from years of scrubbing, stitching, carrying trays, and patching up his endless mistakes. 30 years of handing over every paycheck without a second thought. I remember each desperate promise he made. "Just one more loan, Mom. Just until the business gets on its feet. I swear, this is the last time." I always believed him. Or maybe I needed to believe him, to keep going, to justify the endless sacrifices, to keep the illusion that he needed me, that I mattered. Every time he failed, I picked up the pieces. I sold the jewelry my mother left me. I canceled my own medical checkups. I worked through chest pains, headaches that lasted days, hands so stiff I couldn't even open a jar. I gave him my entire life in neat little envelopes and wire transfers. Now, sitting there with the afternoon sun bleeding through the rose petals, I felt the weight of all those lost years pressed down on me. The rustling leaves above sounded like whispers of all the times I should have said no. I should have saved at least a little for myself, for my health, for some peace in my old age. But love is blind, they say. No, love isn't blind. Love is patient, hopeful, stupidly loyal, and sometimes it's self-destructive. I leaned forward, my elbows digging into my knees, and let out a shaky breath. The garden smelled sweet, almost painfully so. It mocked me with its careless, effortless beauty. In that moment, I realized something terrifying and freeing at the same time. Being alone is better than being used. I looked around at the roses and felt a flicker of something new, something sharp and clear. Anger, maybe. Or resolve. Daniel thought I was too weak to act, too bound by a mother's love to fight back. He counted on my silence, my fear, my endless forgiveness. But he didn't know me as well as he thought. I pushed myself off the bench slowly, my knees creaking in protest. I paused, pressing my hand against the trellis. If he wanted to see me as useless, then I would show him exactly how dangerous a useless old woman could be. The next morning, I found myself sitting on the back porch, a chipped mug of weak tea warming my fingers. The morning air still carried a bit of dew, and the old wooden boards under my chair creaked every time I shifted. My neighbor, Joan, came over like she always did on Saturdays. She shuffled up the steps, balancing her basket of fresh tomatoes from her small greenhouse. "Martha, you look like you've seen a ghost," she said, squinting at me. I forced a thin smile and motioned for her to sit. The truth was, I had been rehearsing what to say all morning. My throat felt tight. My chest burned from holding everything inside for so long. As Joan settled in, she handed me a tomato, bright and firm. I stared at it for a second before putting it aside. "I need to tell you something," I started. The words felt heavy, as though each one carried decades of pain. She listened quietly while I talked, really talked, about the paychecks I handed over, month after month, the debts I covered without a word, the credit cards I paid off in secret, how I paid for Daniel's hospital bills after that car accident he caused when he was drunk, how I cleared his gambling debts so no one would come banging on the door in the middle of the night. I told her how I sold the last gold bracelet my mother gave me just to pay for Daniel's honeymoon when his new wife threatened to leave him over money. Joan's eyes grew wider and wider. At one point, she pressed her palm to her mouth. "You did all that?" she whispered. I nodded, staring out at the yard. The roses were wilting in the morning sun, petals dropping like silent accusations. "He always promised he'd pay me back. He always said he'd take care of me when I got old," I said, my voice cracking at the end. Joan's hand found mine, squeezing it so tightly it almost hurt. "And now he's planning to throw you out?" I let out a low, humorless laugh. "He called me useless, said he'd sell the house and let me rot somewhere else." Joan's face flushed red. "That boy isn't a son. He's a parasite." I looked down at our joined hands, feeling a tear slip down my cheek. Joan wiped it away with her thumb, her touch warm and motherly. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel the betrayal fully. It wasn't just the money. It was every sacrifice. Every night I stayed up, waiting for him to come home. Every meal I skipped so he could eat better. It all crumbled into dust in that one overheard sentence. Joan didn't say much after that. She just sat with me, her presence solid and grounding. And in that silence, I felt something shift. The humiliation began to twist into a new shape, something closer to steel. When Joan finally stood to leave, she hugged me so tightly, I felt my ribs strain. "You know what you have to do now," she whispered into my ear. I nodded against her shoulder. Yes, I knew. A few days later, I forced myself to go to the grocery store. I needed milk and bread, but more than that, I needed a moment to think outside the walls of that house. I pulled my old cardigan tighter around me as I walked down the cereal aisle. Every step felt heavy, like my feet were dragging through mud. My mind kept replaying Daniel's words in an endless loop. I was reaching for a can of soup when I heard a laugh that made my spine straighten like a steel rod. Daniel's laugh, loud and confident, the same laugh he used when he thought he had charmed someone out of money. I turned my head slowly. There he was, leaning against a shelf, his phone pressed to his ear. His eyes glimmered with excitement, like a child bragging about a stolen toy. "No, listen," he was saying to whoever was on the other end. She's got no clue. She thinks I'm fixing up the place for her comfort. I've already got a realtor lined up to come next week. Once it's sold, she'll be out and I'll finally get my freedom. He paused to chuckle. Yeah, I know. I'm a genius. My hand shook so badly, I almost dropped the can. I pressed it to my chest, trying to steady my breath. He kept talking, oblivious. She's outlived her usefulness. She can't even work anymore. What good is she? I'll just send her to some nursing home on the edge of town. Cheapest I can find. I felt the blood drain from my face. My lips parted, but no words came out. I thought I had already heard the worst. But this wasn't just betrayal. It was a death sentence from the one person I thought I could count on. A young mother and her toddler passed by, giving me a curious glance. I forced myself to turn around, clutching my cart so hard my knuckles turned white. I kept moving, trying to appear normal, but inside, my heart roared like a storm. Each word he had said felt like a slap across my face. How many times had I covered for him? How many times had I defended him to neighbors, to teachers, to friends? I gave up my retirement, my dreams of traveling, my chance at peace, also he could live comfortably. And now he was throwing me away like spoiled food. As I waited in line at the checkout, my hands trembled so badly I nearly dropped my wallet. The cashier, a young boy with kind eyes, asked if I was okay. I just nodded, unable to find my voice. When I got back to the car, I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the wheel. My vision blurred with tears, but underneath the pain, a new fire started to burn. Back at home, I sat on the edge of my bed, the grocery bags still unpacked by the door. The late afternoon sun pooled across my quilt, lighting up all the tiny stitches I used to distract myself on sleepless nights. I looked at my hands that had carried Daniel through every scrape, every debt, every childish tantrum turned adult disaster. A small voice in my head said, "It's time." I reached under my bed and pulled out an old, faded ledger. It had been my secret for years, something I kept telling myself I'd finish one day. Every dollar I gave him, every bill I paid, every medical expense I covered. It was all there, scribbled in careful handwriting during those long nights when I pretended he might pay me back someday. I flipped through the pages, each line a tiny stab to my heart. $12,500 for his first business venture that collapsed within 6 months. $9,800 to pay off the loan sharks after his gambling spree. $22,000 for the mortgage when he forgot to make payments. $5,000 for the honeymoon when his wife threatened to leave. The list stretched on, like an endless trail of broken promises. My pen felt heavy as I picked it up again. My hand trembled, but I forced myself to keep writing. Each stroke felt like peeling away another layer of my illusions. By the time I set the pen down, my back ached and my eyes burned. But I felt a strange calm settle in my chest. This wasn't just a list anymore. It was my proof, my story, my final stand. I looked up at the lamp on my nightstand, its warm light casting a soft glow on the ledger. It reminded me of my husband's old reading lamp, the one he'd leave on when waiting for me to come home from a late shift. He always said, "Never let people mistake your kindness for weakness." I had forgotten that for too long. I pressed the ledger to my chest and let my tears fall freely. They weren't tears of helplessness this time. They were tears of release, of finally taking back pieces of myself I didn't even realize were still there. I could almost hear Daniel's mocking voice in my head. "You're just an old woman. You'll never fight me." But as I sat there in the gentle glow of that lamp, something hardened in me. I wasn't just an old woman. I was a mother who had given everything, and I was done being silent. I set the ledger on the nightstand, right next to my wedding photo. I whispered to the room, to my husband, to myself, "It's time to come home to me now." The next morning I set out just after sunrise. The streets were still damp from an early rain, the smell of wet asphalt sharp in the air. I wore my old beige trench coat. The one Daniel used to complain made me look like an abandoned librarian. Today, I wore it proudly. I walked past the bakery where I used to buy his favorite sweet rolls and ignored the pang that shot through my chest. I had no room left for nostalgia, only resolve. A few blocks further, I stopped in front of a small brick building with a green awning, Stein and Harper, attorneys at law. The letters were faded, but I knew they were good. They had helped my friend Margaret with a complicated inheritance fight years ago. I stood there for a minute, my hand hovering over the door handle. My reflection in the glass showed a tired old woman, lines around her mouth, eyes that had seen too many betrayals. Then I pulled the door open and stepped inside. A young receptionist looked up, startled. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" I shook my head. "No, but I need to see someone today. It's urgent." She must have heard the iron in my voice, because she stopped asking questions and led me down a narrow hallway. I ended up across from a woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes and hair pulled tightly into a bun. She introduced herself as Ms. Harper. We sat across from each other at her dark wooden desk. I slid the ledger toward her slowly, as if it weighed 100 pounds. She flipped through the pages silently, her fingers moving quickly, her eyebrows rising higher and higher. Finally, she looked up. "This is extensive," she said carefully. "Do you have supporting documents for these payments? Bank statements, receipts, transfer confirmations?" I nodded and pulled out a worn folder from my bag. Years of records, stacked and labeled. Every sacrifice documented in black and white. Miss Harper's eyes softened slightly. "You've kept meticulous records," she said. I sat up straighter, feeling a strange pride pulse through me. I had to. He was always so careless. Someone had to keep track. She nodded slowly. "Legally, we have a very strong case for financial exploitation, especially given your contributions and the promise of future care. It might take time, but you can claim restitution and ensure he can't touch your property without your consent." I felt my shoulders drop, the tension easing slightly for the first time in weeks. "And about the house?" I asked, my voice small. "We can file an injunction immediately to prevent him from selling it," she replied firmly. "He won't be able to list or transfer ownership without facing serious legal consequences." I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Miss Harper leaned forward. "You are not alone in this anymore, Mrs. Miller. We will handle it together." Hearing those words felt like standing in sunlight after a long, cold winter. When I left the office, I walked past the bakery again. I looked through the window but didn't stop. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the foundation he stood on was about to crack. I wasn't just reclaiming my house. I was reclaiming myself. A week after visiting Ms. Harper, Daniel called and invited me to dinner. He claimed it was to talk things through, but I knew better. His voice was sugary, every word carefully measured. That evening, I set the table myself, laying out the good china I had saved for decades. Each plate felt heavier than usual, as if it carried all the silent arguments we never had. When Daniel arrived, he walked in like he owned the place. His cologne too strong, his smile too wide. He carried a stack of papers tucked under his arm. "Mom," he crooned, kissing my cheek as though nothing had happened. "I thought it'd be good to sort out some maintenance paperwork for the house tonight." I nodded, feigning confusion. "Maintenance?" He gave a soft chuckle, as if I were a slow child. "Yes, you know, routine stuff. It'll make everything easier for you later. You don't want to worry about property taxes and repairs at your age, right?" I stirred the soup slowly, hiding the disgust bubbling in my chest. We sat down to eat, and he talked nonstop about new investments, new business ventures, and how we needed to be smart about our assets. His hands moved like a magician's, flipping through documents, gesturing at signature lines. "Just sign here, Mom. It'll save you a world of trouble down the line." I picked up one of the papers and squinted, pretending to struggle. Inside, my pulse was steady and cold. I remembered every moment I had waited for his promises to come true. Every doctor's bill he left for me. Every night I stayed up, waiting to hear his key in the door so I could know he was alive. And here he was, trying to charm me into giving up the last piece of my independence, my home, my dignity, my right to exist on my own terms. I set the paper down and sighed dramatically. You know, Daniel, you've always been so good with this complicated stuff. I don't know why I even bother trying to understand it. His eyes glimmered, hungry. Exactly. You don't need to. Just trust me. I tilted my head, watching him the way you might watch a snake slither through grass. Trust, I echoed, almost whispering. He didn't notice the steel under my words. He just leaned forward eagerly, pushing the pen toward me. I pushed it back slowly, meeting his eyes. Why don't we finish dinner first? You must be starving. His smile twitched. He tried to hide his annoyance, but I saw it. A tiny crack in his perfect act. We ate in near silence after that. I let him fill the air with nervous chatter, nodding at all the right moments, my mind already far ahead. He had no idea that just a few blocks away, Miss Harper was finalizing the injunction papers. No idea that tomorrow, his little scheme would collapse in a courtroom. As I cleared the plates, he started again. Mom, about the papers. I looked at him and smiled so softly he almost didn't catch the coldness behind it. Let's not ruin a nice dinner with business tonight. He tried to argue, but I turned away, carrying the dishes to the sink. For the first time in my life, I felt the upper hand settle firmly into my grasp. After that dinner, I retreated to my sewing room. The small space smelled of old fabric and lavender sachets. A single lamp lit the corner where my sewing machine sat, the needle poised mid-stitch on a half-finished apron I'd meant to make for Daniel's wife years ago. A gift I never finished once I saw the way she looked at me, like I was dirt under her shoes. I pulled the old apron aside and laid my ledger on the table, smoothing it out like a sacred text. Every evening that week, I sat there for hours, going over the figures, matching them against my bank records and receipts. Each page was a testament to the life I had sacrificed piece by piece, a quilt of numbers that stitched together the truth he thought I'd bury with my silence. Between checking columns and recalculating, I ran my fingers over a basket of old family photos on the shelf. Daniel's baby picture, his first day of school, his graduation photo, the only one where I saw a hint of real joy in his eyes, before greed swallowed him whole. I thought about my late husband's voice, echoing from the past. Don't let him take everything, Martha. Leave something for yourself. I hadn't listened then. But now? Now there was no turning back. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the room settle around me like a protective cloak. The needle on the sewing machine glinted in the lamplight. It reminded me of a tiny sword, precise, unforgiving, and strong despite its size. I imagined Daniel pacing in his room, rehearsing what he'd say to me next, how he'd spin his lies, how he'd feign concern. The image almost made me laugh. My fingers moved on their own, picking up a scrap of fabric and feeding it through the machine. The hum of the motor vibrated through my bones, grounding me. Each stitch felt like a heartbeat, each line a vow. I would finish this fight in my own way, patient, careful, and with the same quiet strength that had carried me through decades of sacrifice. When I finally stood, my back ached, and my legs felt stiff, but my mind had never been clearer. I put the finished scrap down and looked at the small pile of evidence on my table. Then I reached for my mirror, inspecting my reflection under the harsh lamp. I didn't see a helpless old woman. I saw a survivor. Someone who had been pushed to the edge and found her footing, steady and unyielding. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. My hands felt steady, my breathing even. I dressed carefully, choosing a soft blue blouse and my simple pearl earrings, a small armor of dignity. After making a single slice of toast and pouring myself weak tea, I sat at the kitchen table and dialed the realtor's number. The same woman Daniel had bragged about to his friend in the grocery store. Hello, this is Mrs. Miller. Yes, I'd like to discuss selling my house. A pause on the line. I could almost hear her surprise. Yes, I am the owner. No, my son does not speak for me. I'll be handling everything directly. The words rolled off my tongue like water, each one sharpening into a blade. By noon, she arrived at my door, young, efficient-looking, her heels clicking sharply on the porch. She carried a binder and a forced smile. She was expecting Daniel to be here, to run the show. Instead, she found me. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. She faltered for a moment, eyes scanning behind me as if Daniel might leap out from the shadows. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had once begged for tuition money, the same place he had cried after his first failed investment. I watched her face as I laid out my documents, my identification, the ledger, my official injunction papers. "This house is mine," I said calmly, "and I am selling it on my terms. No hidden deals, no under-the-table arrangements." She blinked rapidly, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through my paperwork. "Of course, Mrs. Miller. Of course." Her rehearsed politeness slipped. Underneath, I saw a flicker of respect, and maybe a hint of fear. When she asked about pricing, I gave her a number higher than Daniel would have dared to dream. This wasn't about the money. It was about declaring to the world, and to myself, that I held the reins now. We signed the preliminary paperwork. She promised to list it discreetly, without Daniel's knowledge. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused by the door. "You're stronger than I expected," she said softly. I just nodded, my fingers curling lightly around the door frame. "Quiet doesn't mean weak," I replied. She left quickly after that, almost as if she feared I might change my mind and toss her out. When the door finally clicked shut, I stood in the hallway for a long time, breathing deeply. Outside, the sun had shifted higher in the sky, spilling warmth across my worn rug. I felt something shift inside me too, an opening, a first breath after years underwater. I went to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. The roses were wilting, but in that moment I didn't see decay. I saw room for something new to bloom. Tomorrow I would inform Ms. Harper. Tomorrow I would finalize the account transfers. Daniel's empire of illusions was already crumbling. That evening, after the realtor left, I found myself at the kitchen sink, scrubbing an old pot I hadn't used in years. The warm water flowed over my hands, and for a moment it felt almost like it used to, comforting, familiar. But tonight, it felt different. Each swirl of the sponge felt like a small act of reclaiming. As I scrubbed, memories flooded me. The time Daniel came home drunk, vomiting on the floor, and I stayed up all night cleaning, terrified he might choke in his sleep. The time he crashed his car and called me at 3 a.m., crying, begging me to pay for repairs before anyone found out. The time he promised he'd start fresh, get a real job, make me proud, and instead disappeared for days, leaving me pacing the porch in my nightgown, praying to hear his footsteps. I stopped scrubbing and leaned over the sink, the water rushing past my fingers. My reflection shimmered in the window above the sink. A tired old woman, hair fraying at the edges, but her eyes were no longer lost. I could see it now, so painfully clear. I had been the glue holding his life together, while mine slowly cracked, piece by piece. I straightened my back, water dripping from my fingertips onto the floor. In that moment, a surge of strength rose in me, hotter and sharper than anything I'd ever felt. "What is love without respect?" I whispered to the empty kitchen. I turned off the faucet and wiped my hands on my apron. Then, I picked up a folded piece of paper I had left by the fruit bowl, a draft of my court statement. I had rewritten it over and over these past few days. Each version felt like peeling away another layer of shame, until all that remained was the raw, undeniable truth. I sat at the table and unfolded it again. The words stared back at me, strong and defiant. I began reading it aloud, rehearsing. My voice wobbled at first, but then grew steady, gaining weight with each sentence. "You only miss me now that I said no," I read firmly, letting the words echo in the small kitchen. I paused to catch my breath, feeling my heart pound in my chest, not from fear, but from power. I read the statement 3 times before finally setting it down. Each repetition felt like a hammer, driving a nail deeper into the coffin of the life Daniel had built on my sacrifices. By the time I finished, I didn't feel like a fragile mother anymore. I felt like a warrior, one who had survived the quietest, slowest war of all, the war of love, twisted into chains. I folded the statement neatly, placed it in my purse, and zipped it shut. Tomorrow, it would go to Miss Harper. Tomorrow, I would prepare to face Daniel in court. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my study, the moonlight spilling across my old oak desk. The house was silent except for the creaks in the walls and the occasional rustle of wind through the roses outside. I laid out every document, the ledger, the bank statements, the receipts, each piece like a shard of glass reflecting years of sacrifice. I moved slowly, methodically, sliding each paper into a neat folder. My fingers shook once or twice, but I forced them to steady. There was no room for hesitation now. A stack of notarized copies sat beside me, ready for Miss Harper tomorrow. I labeled each one in my tight, careful handwriting. As I worked, my mind wandered to the nights I stayed up with Daniel's fevers, the birthday cakes I baked from scratch, the report cards I saved in a shoebox upstairs. All those small moments I thought were investments in love. They were actually loans with no intention of repayment. I pressed my palms flat against the folder, letting out a shaky breath. The moonlight shone on my hands, making them look almost translucent, so thin and lined but strong, stronger than even I had ever known. I glanced at a photograph on my bookshelf. Me, my husband, and a young Daniel standing proudly in front of this very house. Back then, I believed this house would be his safe haven forever. I thought he'd grow into a man who'd shelter me in return. Instead, he saw it as a prize to cash in once I was no longer useful. I shook my head slowly, my jaw tightening. I picked up my final draft of the court statement and read it again under the moonlight. My voice was low but firm. I gave you every paycheck, every heartbeat, every ounce of my youth. You called me useless, but it's my hands that built the roof over your head. Now these same hands are taking it all back. I could almost imagine Daniel's face when he realized I had flipped the game on him. The thought didn't fill me with guilt. It filled me with a quiet, unexpected joy. I tucked the papers into my bag and zipped it shut. Then, I went to the safe behind the bookshelf and slid in the most critical evidence. Backups, just in case. As I closed the safe, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in decades, I wasn't living in fear of his next demand, his next scheme. I turned off the lamp and stood by the window, watching the moon drift higher in the sky. The roses swayed in the darkness, whispering secrets to the night air. Tomorrow I would file everything officially. Tomorrow the final chains would fall. I pressed my hand to the cold glass and whispered to the moon, "Being alone is better than being used." And for the first time, I truly believed it. At dawn, I woke up before the alarm, the sky still a soft gray hush. I dressed quietly, choosing a simple dress I hadn't worn in years. Navy blue, the one I used to wear when I felt proud of myself. Today, I felt something even stronger than pride: freedom. I made a small breakfast, toast and black coffee, but barely touched it. My hands were steady, my heart surprisingly calm. I looked around the kitchen one last time. Every corner held a memory. Daniel's childish drawings still pinned on the fridge, the dented kettle I used to prepare his bedtime milk, the worn table where I patched together every financial rescue plan he ever needed. But I didn't feel sentimental anymore. I felt resolute. I grabbed my bag, the folder of final documents zipped inside, and stepped out into the early morning chill. The roses in the yard shivered slightly in the breeze, as if they too sensed this was the end of something. At the lawyer's office, Miss Harper greeted me with a firm handshake. She didn't need to ask if I was ready. She could see it in my eyes. We went over the last papers together. The house sale finalized into my private account, safe and untouchable. The evidence sealed and ready for court. The injunction filed. The restitution case against Daniel officially launched. As I signed the final page, I felt my shoulders drop, as though 1,000 invisible bricks had been lifted off me. When we finished, Miss Harper leaned back, studying me for a moment. "You've done something many people never find the courage to do," she said quietly. I only nodded. "It took me 30 years to say no," I said, my voice low but unwavering. But I said it. After leaving her office, I returned home for the last time. Inside, it felt like a museum of a life I no longer belonged to. I moved from room to room, touching old picture frames, folded quilts, and the chair where I had sat for countless sleepless nights. Finally, I went to the kitchen and took out a notepad. I wrote just 6 words. "Good luck supporting yourself. Mom." I left it on the table where he'd find it easily. I didn't need to explain or beg or justify myself anymore. I took one last look at the house, inhaled deeply, and stepped out into the brightening day. As I closed the door behind me, I felt lighter than I had in decades. My feet felt firm on the ground. My spine felt straight, strong. I walked to the car waiting outside. A taxi to my temporary new apartment, a place chosen by me, paid by me, fully mine. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. Daniel would return to find the empty house and that short note. He would sputter, curse, maybe even try to call. But it wouldn't matter. For the first time in my life, I wasn't his safety net. I wasn't his servant, his silent financier, or his emotional sponge. The day of the hearing arrived gray and damp, the kind of weather that makes most people want to stay in bed. But I felt more awake than I had in years. At the courthouse, I sat alone on a hard bench, my folder of evidence on my lap. Around me, the low murmur of lawyers and families blurred into a distant hum. Then I saw him, Daniel. He walked in, flanked by his lawyer, looking around as if expecting a show of support, as if someone might rush to reassure him. But no one came. When he saw me, he froze for a second, his face twisted in confusion, then anger, and finally something I hadn't seen in him for decades: fear. We were called in. I stood up slowly, feeling my knees crack, but I refused to let them buckle. Inside the courtroom, the judge's gavel struck, and the room fell silent. Daniel's lawyer began, trying to spin a tale of a misunderstanding, portraying me as a frail, confused old woman who had misinterpreted everything. I listened, silent and still, my hands folded calmly on my folder. When it was my turn, Miss Harper rose, her voice firm and steady. She laid out every piece of evidence: the ledger, bank records, medical bills, receipts for debts I covered, copies of text messages promising repayment, recordings of his words about the house. The judge flipped through the stack, expression growing darker with each page. Then, it was my moment. I stood, my heart pounding but my mind sharp. I opened my statement, the same one I had read aloud so many times in my kitchen. My voice trembled only at the start, but I pressed on. I gave my son every paycheck, every ounce of my energy, every piece of my heart. In return, he called me useless, plotted to steal my home, and planned to discard me like garbage. But I am not weak. Quiet doesn't mean weak. I am here today because I refuse to disappear silently. I refuse to let love be twisted into chains. The courtroom stayed painfully still as my words echoed. Daniel shifted in his seat, pale and sweating, his lawyer whispering frantically into his ear. When I finished, I closed my papers and looked at the judge. In that moment, I didn't feel small. I felt taller than I had ever felt beside Daniel. The judge took a long pause before finally speaking. He ordered that Daniel repay a large portion of the money I had documented within strict time limits. He ruled that Daniel's actions amounted to financial exploitation of an elder and ordered compensation for emotional damages, as well as my full legal fees. Daniel slumped forward as if someone had pulled the bones out of his back. His lawyer sat with his head in his hands. I stood motionless, my breath slow and deep. As we left, I felt a hand on my arm. Miss Harper, her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she whispered. Outside the courtroom, the cold air hit my face like a blessing. Daniel fell to his knees on the courthouse steps, sobbing into his hands. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't walking away in shame. I was walking away in victory. Outside the courthouse, I paused for a moment to glance back, not out of regret, but to mark the final chapter of this long, twisted story. Daniel was still on the steps, his knees scraping against the rough concrete. His suit jacket was wrinkled and damp from his tears, his hair plastered to his forehead. I watched as he buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with sobs that echoed against the cold stone walls. People passed by, some pausing to stare, others avoiding him completely. The son who had always strutted around town, boasting about his house and his success, now looked like a child who had lost his favorite toy. For a fleeting second, I felt a pang of something close to pity. But then it slipped away, replaced by a calm clarity that settled deep in my bones. He had called me useless. He had planned to erase me from the very life I built for him. But now, it was he who was alone, crumpled, and exposed. I turned and kept walking. Each step felt lighter, as if the ground itself was lifting me forward. Today, I didn't even flinch. Ms. Harper joined me, her briefcase in hand. She looked at me with that same mixture of relief and admiration I saw when we first reviewed my evidence together. "Let's get you home," she said softly. I nodded, and we walked to the street where a cab was waiting. Inside, I sat in the back seat, clutching the folder of final court orders. I watched the city drift by, the bakery where I used to buy Daniel treats when he was little, the corner park where I once pushed him on the swings, the street he used to bike down with skinned knees and a wild laugh. All those memories felt like pages from someone else's life. Someone naive. Someone who still believed love alone could save a person from themselves. When we arrived at Ms. Harper's office, she helped me out of the cab. Inside, she poured us each a cup of tea, her office warm and welcoming. She laid the documents neatly on her desk. "The financial restitution must be paid back within 12 months, she said. "Failure to do so will result in the seizure of his assets. And the compensation for emotional harm, that's already secured from the house, proceeds." I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. I felt my shoulders finally loosen, the ache in my spine easing for the first time in years. I set my cup down and looked at Ms. Harper. "I thought I'd feel angry still, or sad," I admitted. She shook her head gently. "That's because you're finally free, Martha. Real freedom isn't loud. It's quiet, just like you." I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heartbeat strong and steady. I thought of all those nights I'd lain awake, replaying every word Daniel had thrown at me, every insult, every manipulation. I thought of all the times I swallowed my own needs so he wouldn't have to feel discomfort. Now, he would feel it all on his own. As I left Ms. Harper's office, I stepped out into the afternoon sun, which had broken through the clouds. The light hit my face, warm and almost playful. I paused on the sidewalk, tipping my head back, letting the sun pour over me. I didn't have a house anymore, not the one that had become my prison, but I had something so much more precious, the power to choose where I would go next, who I would be, how I would live. And Daniel? He could finally learn what it felt like to stand alone, the same loneliness he had planned for me. I turned and started walking, my steps light and certain. Tomorrow, I would decide where to plant my new roots. But today, I simply walked forward, breathing fully for the first time in 30 years.